Hi, my name's Mark from Canny Gaming. Today I'm starting a new series of videos looking at design and planning in Workers and Resources Soviet Republic. This first one is looking at highways in the game. We're on the highway north of Kocise in Slovakia. Before we get there, let's talk about highways. One idea in urban planning is that roadways should be designated as one of three types. A roadway is either a highway, a distributor road, or a street. What I'm proposing for some design principles for Workers and Resources is that every roadway in the game should be designated as one of those three. Mentally, in your mind, you don't need to write anything down, but before you build anything, think about it. Will it be a highway, a distributor road, or a street? And we then should design the roadway and buildings around it accordingly. The main purpose of highways is to allow traffic to travel as quickly as possible, and they should normally be situated outside urban areas. Even if we don't immediately construct a proper highway, we need to bear in mind how difficult it can be to redesign things later so that we can add highways when we need them. This is true even if you're not using realistic mode. This video is intended to show how you can plan for that. Here we are a little way from Kocise. From 1948 to 1989, Slovakia was part of the Soviet system and had a planned economy. Many of the assets in game look very similar to the buildings here, and the developers included a number of photos of the city in the game loading screens. My guess is that the developer comes from Kocise, so it is a useful example to use to illustrate issues in the game. Focusing in on one area of the city, we see many Soviet-era apartment blocks. This oval shape is not a running track but a tram end station. We can follow along a wide road with tram tracks which looks like it is undergoing extensive maintenance or reconstruction work. We reach an elevated highway that connects the city to other parts of Slovakia. It crosses the river and continues north. Following it a little way, we see what might be a gas station on either side, a larger warehouse or factory, and a building with a number of yellow vehicles outside. This is Google Street View on that highway in Kocise. I think we can see clearly that this is not what I would normally call in the UK a motorway. It's not just because it's only 2 lanes wide on each of the carriageways. It doesn't have barriers along the side, while it does have a footpath. Therefore, it is possible for pedestrians to actually cross this road. They would have to climb over the barriers in the middle, but they're not high and that's easily done. Nevertheless, I guess they are discouraged from doing that. And I am pretty sure that there are restrictions on this road, like a minimum speed, and not allowing bicycles, etc. I think it clearly follows the highway model, which is broad enough to cover this type of road, and we'll have a further look at that in a second. And to note, in comparison with the highway you saw earlier in the video, that is a very recent road, built to the highest modern standards. While this roadway is clearly much older, and I believe it was constructed during the Soviet era. Now, looking over near the open hull truck, that is definitely a gas station across the road. On this side of the road, what we have on the right is the building we could see from above next to the highway with all of the yellow vehicles. These are excavators and bulldozers, cherry pickers, portable generator, and that sort of thing, construction equipment. The orange ones are rollers. I don't think this is a construction office as such. I think that's probably a place where you can buy construction equipment or you can hire it. Anyway, the 2 lanes of the carriageway obviously go ahead of us, and there is a slip road here that would take you to the fuel station on this side of the road. So note, the first thing is you do not have a fuel station on just one side of the highway. That isn't allowed. The traffic on the other carriageway cannot turn into this fuel station. There's no way to do that because of the barriers down the middle. You have to have 2 fuel stations or handle these in some other way. It's not uncommon in some of the older roads in Europe and North America to have short slip roads like this on and off the highways, though more modern roads would probably be much longer for safety. There's the entrance into that construction sales place. Here, just next to this, there's some sort of warehouse. This is still the actual slip road off the highway, and it's a fairly narrow road, There's no lane markings, and I think that's because it is only a single lane and only going in one direction. On the left, I think, is the entrance to a dealership selling cars and vans. We come around the bend here, and this is still part of the slip road leaving the highway. We then get to this junction, which has another entrance to the same warehouse. We're just looking at it from the other side now. The sign suggests it's some sort of manufacturer of sportswear. That looks like a very old bus stop. There's the bridge over the highway, so it goes up relatively steeply with a fairly abrupt change of gradient at the top, where it then goes flat across the top of the highway. That bridge would take us to the other side of the highway to go south, while opposite us is another slip road that is to join the highway going north. Now I know that this is all the slip road that we came along because there is a no entry sign here. The only way for that white car to get there is to actually come off the highway and follow the slip road and then turn into these parking spaces. You can't drive past that no entry sign from here because that is a one-way road. This last 100 metres is a bit messy, I know that, but I think it highlights what I wanted to show as some real-life road in an ex-Soviet republic in Kocise, which meets the criteria of a highway. If we come back to the highway, the main thing is that this slip road is the only exit from the highway in this area. The exits are always on the right hand side of the road, and there is absolutely no crossover between the two carriageways progressing along the road. Here is the slip road joining from the gas station that allows people who get fuel to come back onto the carriageway. And there is the dealership we saw from the other side. There's no connection between that dealership and this highway. You cannot turn in and out from here. If we continue, we go under the bridge that we saw earlier. Let me see how far to the next junction. We're following along behind this covered hull, and there is another slip road. So the junction is not that far away, but there's not random connections to this road along the way. You see again, fairly short slip roads off and on, but very clearly still slip roads that allow traffic to merge so that people have some opportunity to decelerate and accelerate. Unlike the previous junction with the commercial properties, here we see some residential properties. The citizens living here have houses which face onto a street that then joins a small distributor road and then onto the highway from the slip road. So the highway has limited access on and off, and there's no direct access from any residential or commercial properties. It is intended to be a high-speed road because it's got two carriageways of traffic, and it has the acceleration and deceleration access with the slip roads. Interestingly, right in front of us, look at those tyre tracks where somebody has come screeching to a halt along here and then has veered off slightly into the slip road, possibly hitting another vehicle. I suspect somebody has got here just as a vehicle was turning out of that slip road. They've hit the brakes at high speed and come to a sudden halt. The current speed limit on a motorway in Slovakia is 130 km per hour, but 90 in a built-up area. So I guess this could be 90, but I bet it was 130 in the past and has then been reduced to improve safety. And one final thing to notice on this real-life highway in Kocise is that it has lights. So it is fully lit at night time. That's particularly important during winter months when it could get dark as early as 1700, when traffic is still very busy with people going home from work. This road is designed to deal with heavy traffic volumes and to ensure it keeps moving at all times of the day in all weathers. We shouldn't get carried away with the road traffic regulations that apply in different countries, nor that many countries have more than one type of fast roads like this. We can broadly designate them all as highways. We need highways now Soviet republics and to use them appropriately. Here we are with a fairly simple republic early in the game in 1960. I'm playing with unlimited money. There's no realistic mode. It's purely to test and develop some ideas. By the way, I've got power and fuel enabled for the buildings and for the vehicles. Also, I have the day-night cycle turned on. I don't have seasons enabled. I have a road coming from the large customs house down the bottom there. I've tried to copy what we saw in Kocise. I have a couple of warehouses, a small one on the left and a bigger one on the right, and I have a modded clothing factory. So we can pretend that we've got some sort of factory that's making sports gear or something like that. It needs fabric and it's going to produce clothes, so we've got some trucks going to it. Here I've got a small modded construction office with a couple of construction vehicles in there. There's a gas station here as well, and next to it in front of the substation there's a bit of on-street parking. This is a mod that allows parking spaces to be on either side of a road. I think that's quite a nice mod actually, because we can't enable parking on the vanilla roads themselves. And there's a bus stop here. I've got buses bringing people from the border because I haven't got any population on this map yet. They get dropped off here and then walk through to the factory. I've set up an aggregate storage here just so that gets more vehicles on the road. And you know this is not an unusual setup for many starting situations. The road coming from the customs house is perhaps a little bit longer than many people might do it. But the one thing with this particular map, I think this is the Flatlands map, is that there's a river very close to the customs house. So that does prevent you from building much on that side of the road. What I've assumed is the industry would go here right in front of us. Various resources, oil, coal and iron are in that direction, and the highway would continue from here straight across the map. So I've got a main road which curves round and comes up straight. And the intention is it would go up this road into a residential area, into a city. And that would be where our workers live. A fundamental principle of highways is that they are not really for local connections, but to connect cities and major industrial centres together, which is exactly what we want to do here. In fact, the modern definition would mean that new highways are never built within cities. This wasn't always the case. Historically, highways in many countries were built right into the heart of various cities, and they then have remained in those positions and caused planners huge issues. We won't build this highway into the city, but we may eventually extend it out across the map from here in this direction. So I have tried to initiate the setup at Kocise along the real-life highway. And I've done it also in a way that makes a lot of sense if you're really developing this map and building a republic of your own. It's not impossible that you would have a map just like this. It's an artificial setup only in the sense that I've got unlimited money and not playing realistic mode. What I'm doing in the time lapse is showing the process of developing this road as a highway. Now you might not want to do this in the first years of the game if you're playing in realistic mode. You almost certainly wouldn't. And there's nothing in the traffic here that would start to suggest that you must do this. You might do this in stages and only fully implement it later in the game. But you still want to designate it as a highway very early on so that you can prepare for this as the years progress. And having a clear idea of what you're going to want to achieve later is important even at this stage. The most famous name in Czechoslovakia for road vehicles is probably Skoda. The two guys who set up the company started out making bicycles. Then they moved into making bicycles with engines, early motorbikes. In fact, they are often credited as the first company to manufacture motorbikes. Czechoslovakia had become independent from Austria-Hungary, and they were a major manufacturer of cars. Important developments in their cars in the early 1930s saw them become the biggest in Czechoslovakia, and they remained a significant manufacturer in Europe throughout the 20th century. Cars were not nearly as numerous as in the US, nor, due to lower incomes, as much as in Germany or the UK. Yet even by the 1930s, there were significant numbers of motorised vehicles on the roads in Czechoslovakia. It is wrong to imagine that in 1960 there were no cars in Kocise. There was, though personal car ownership was lower than, for instance, East Germany, as the German regime in the 1930s had promoted car ownership and had their own car manufacturers. By the 1930s, the effect of growing numbers of cars and trucks on the road and the possibility of replacing some rail and canal journeys with trucks began to exercise the minds of planners and politicians in many countries. In Czechoslovakia, there was a plan to build a series of motorways, and a government decree was issued. But like most countries, this never really went beyond the planning stage before war broke out in 1939. The exception was in Germany, where the Autobahn network was created in a remarkable time, with just over 2,000 kilometers built in a few years. Germany occupied parts of Czechoslovakia, but the same rapid expansion of motorways didn't take place under their control. Plans to build a motorway connecting Vienna and Prague were prepared, and a motorway connecting Prague to Slovakia, but once there was all-out war, these plans were shelved. The focus was in producing armaments. But the political situation affecting Kocise was even more complicated, as it transferred from Slovakia to Hungary in 1938, and then back again after the war. So its government changed several times during the period we are talking about. Following the war, Czechoslovakia was liberated from Germany, but became occupied by the Soviet army. The post-war government reinitiated the motorway plans, and some work was done to connect Prague before the communists came to power in Czechoslovakia, forming the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. They immediately cancelled the motorway plans. It is important to understand that they were not anti-car, though there was a suspicion among some socialist politicians that the significant increase in personal cars in the 1930s had been somewhat of a capitalist anomaly, and this would not be sustained. But the main issue was money to complete the project, and the strategic emphasis on military needs because of the risk of a new war between the Soviet Union and the West during the Cold War. To understand the financial difficulties, we need to remember that the northern part of Czechoslovakia had become part of Greater Germany, and Slovakia, though officially independent, had also joined the Axis and had sent troops to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. The Soviet Union had lost 20 million citizens in the war and suffered a massive destruction of cities, industry and infrastructure. The Soviets extracted massive reparations from the countries they occupied that had taken part in the war against them. Not just Germany itself, but Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary and Czechoslovakia had been involved in that invasion. The Soviets were assisted by the communist parties that took power. This also involved often agreeing terms of trade significantly in favour of the Soviet Union. As the Cold War developed, trade with the West became increasingly difficult. Czechoslovakia didn't have the dollars needed to buy many things on the international market, except where it could raise funds by selling its own products abroad. But before they could do that, there was a need to overcome major dislocations that occurred in the transition to the centrally planned economy in the late 1940s and early 50s. Skoda had previously imported many parts for its cars from Germany and Italy, but that would be largely impossible during the Cold War, and new sources within the Eastern Bloc countries needed to be found or developed within Czechoslovakia. By 1955, the government had set up domestic suppliers to provide 90% of the parts needed, when before the war only 15% came from domestic sources. But at the cost of quality. Skoda cars had a somewhat comical reputation for their quality in the West, maybe unfairly because some people loved them and you could see reasonable numbers of Skodas driving on the roads of the UK and other NATO countries in the 1970s and 1980s. Typical of these were the Skoda 1000 MB, produced in the 1960s. But Skoda was never on the scale of some other international car manufacturers in Europe, even before the Asian manufacturers got involved. Nevertheless, the automotive industry in Czechoslovakia accounted for a large proportion of the industrial output of the country. This is the massive Skoda auto plant in Czechia, still employing 23,000 workers. You can see the city to the right with many prefab apartment buildings from the Soviet era. The plant sits alongside a main highway that links the area to Prague and the rest of Europe. Czechoslovakia didn't have the economic ability to invest in motorways in the 1950s. Though use of motor vehicles, including personal car and motorbike ownership, did increase steadily, though getting a car was difficult. Sometimes there were waiting lists of several years, but a healthy black market developed, particularly with used cars. But the use of trucks on the roads also increased, and trucks steadily began to replace rail in some areas as the preferred method of local transportation of goods and resources. By the 1960s, the plans for motorways were dusted off again, but still the country was held back by a lack of money and the political will to carry out this project. Emphasis was on improving the living standards of workers, and that mainly involved building more housing to a better standard and rebuilding from the destruction of the war. Though increasingly we see a recognition from the party that having access to a car could be an important part of a better standard of living for workers. At first, the cars went to the managers of factories and enterprises, government officials, the police and military, but slowly more and more people had them. The Skoda 1000 MB was sold from 1964 to 1969, with a total of 443,000 produced. Just over half were sold abroad, representing an important stream of income for the country. But it still means that about 200,000 MBs were sold in Czechoslovakia. The successor to that was the Skoda 100 series, which was built from 1969 to 1977, and just over 1 million were produced. This 1985 picture from the game of a shopping centre in Kocise shows one parked outside. Nearly everyone who worked in cities lived in those cities and had readily available mass transport by bus, rail or tram to get to work, so commuting to work from outside the cities was not common. And this was the case in Kocise, which had an extensive tram network. But within the older cities, traffic was already a problem, especially in the historic centres where space was limited. Redevelopment within cities to provide additional capacity both for driving and parking of cars was an issue, and not just because of increased demand for cars, but because populations increased significantly during this period. The cars shared the roads with trucks, buses and trams, all of which grew as populations grew, and the proportion of the population living in cities also increased as agriculture was mechanized. To note, the so-called car companies in Czechoslovakia were also having to produce all of the tractors, harvesters, construction and military vehicles, trucks and buses that were needed at that time. Hardly any were imported, and even they produced trains and trams in their factories, as well as motor vehicles. By 1990, there were 2 million personal cars registered in the newly created Czech Republic, or Czechia, and 800,000 in Slovakia. Slovakia had a population of only 5.3 million. That's half that of Czechia, so number of cars as a proportion of the population in Slovakia is much lower, and is in fact the lowest in Europe. It's an important statistic. We don't want to get carried away with a US-style city. But the comparison we want to emphasize is not with the numbers of cars in other countries in real life, but the number of cars that are often used in the game. We can see many gameplay videos where there are more firefighting helicopters than personal cars. So in a workers' and resources republic based on Kocise and the region around it, we might legitimately not have very high personal car use in 1990. But it's wrong that there were no personal cars even in 1960. There was, and it steadily rose over the next 30 years. And it is wrong to assume that there was no demand for improvements to the road network in the 1960s and onwards. This pressure from workers and enterprises grew and was recognised by planners, even if they struggled to meet that need. Eventually, some sections of motorways were built during the 1970s, and a section was opened connecting Kocise to Prešov in 1980. It was only 19 kilometres long. I believe that's the roadway that we looked at before, though I've struggled to find any firm confirmation of that online. So while the plans were there from the 1930s, only a part was actually realised during the centrally planned era. The video of driving on a highway was not from the road opened in 1980. What you saw was a road that opened only a few years ago. A modern motorway network is now nearly complete. Only a few small sections remain in the construction and planning stages, linking Bratislava to the eastern parts of Slovakia. European Union assistance has been available for this, as the EU promotes a Europe-wide integrated plan for motorways connecting from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. The situation in each centrally planned economy varied widely, and also between regions. Let's remind ourselves, East Germany in the Soviet era inherited a lot of fairly well-built and fast highways from the Autobahn network, as well as a reasonably high personal car ownership. Not on the level of the US, of course, but far higher than in Russia, for instance. If you want personal cars in 1960 or even in an earlier start in workers' and resources, you can have them. There is no real-life justification to not have any cars in your republic. Cars and motorbikes existed and add an interesting gameplay element. You have to balance the additional loyalty benefits they bring to your citizens with the considerable additional traffic, and there are differences in behaviour of citizens who have a motor vehicle and those without. Of course, buying significant numbers of them from the customs house is not easy. Rubles are an issue at the start of the game, but they are not blocked by research, and developing highways can be costly and time-consuming in realistic mode. Perhaps you also won't develop a proper highway in your republic until 1980. Perhaps you prefer to issue personal cars only once you are in a position to manufacture them yourself late in the game. That can make a lot of sense, but you may then suddenly meet the problems of providing parking in densely built cities and some awful traffic at certain junctions. Anyway, in this republic, I have decided to start the opposite way around by developing some highway in the early 1960s. Unlike the Czechoslovakian government, I have unlimited money, but I will limit myself almost entirely to this section of highway for at least the foreseeable future, even if it is plainly not sufficient. And this isn't going to become a series about building road intersections or traffic management. But I will definitely have some personal cars and motorbikes, and I will try to simulate from the earliest possible point the pressures on the road network. Sure, I will be developing mass transit solutions, but I will make it a rule that a proportion of my citizens will have their own vehicles, and I won't be over-relying on trains where short journeys are required. And no, I definitely won't be building an Eastern European republic relying on helicopters, absolutely not. Show me a fleet of helicopters building apartments in Kocise, and I might change my mind. It's cool to watch them, of course, great fun, but we're going to try to stick to some real-life scenarios. If I veer away from it, such as building the short length of highway near Kocise 20 years before it really happened, then I will explain it. If you think it is wrong, let me know. If you haven't guessed yet, this isn't going to be your standard workers and resources gameplay video. We're going to be talking sometimes about history, economics, politics, architecture, urban planning, public policy, demographics, healthcare, etc. Related heavily to the game, of course, and how these areas appear to have influenced the style and ideas behind the game. It is a unique game, I think, in concentrating on this period and part of the world, and I hope to find many interesting topics over the next few months to bring you. But as they require some thought and research, I won't be churning out videos every day or two. If this is something which interests you, then please subscribe to get reminders when new videos come out. I want to get this road on the left partially upgraded as soon as possible and allow for the possibility to put the traffic onto that. I think it's also worth noticing here that the lights on the asphalt road appear on the left or the right of the roadway depending on how you drag your mouse. When you drag the mouse, before you release the mouse button, you can actually visually see where the lights are going to appear. So if you want to have them a particular way, then remember to check how they appear before you release the mouse. I've tried to get it so they're both in the middle, but you might want it so that they're both on the outside, whichever way you prefer. But in this recording, I didn't get it perfect, and I go back later off camera and correct it. Now I'm going to finish off this intersection here. I've put in a bracing here, a mud road between this terraforming that I'm doing and the carriageway. So temporarily there's actually 3 roads side by side here, the 2 asphalt carriageways and the mud road. This is to prevent the terraforming from causing the highway road to become deformed. Unfortunately, the terraforming, if it's done close to a road, will cause the road surface to buckle. Problems also happen with rail lines in the game when you're terraforming close to them. So the way to prevent it is just add the temporary road. So the mud road will be buckled slightly, but that's fine because I'm going to take that mud road out as soon as I've built the intersection. When I raise the ground level up, I have the measuring tool visible on the screen so that I can make sure I raise the terrain to 22 meters. I've already checked the ground where I've started the bridge is 13 meters high, and I want a difference to be 9 meters. 9 meters will get nicely over the highway. I've gone up 9 meters by pressing the E key 3 times. Each time you press the E key, it goes up by 3 meters. You can also see the way I did the slip roads there on that side of the carriageway. I made sure that they're splayed out fairly wide because I needed room to fit in the bridge between them. The bridges are a little wider than a normal road, so you've got to make sure that you leave enough space. And I also needed enough of a gap to connect the slip roads into the end of the bridge. I didn't leave much room there, but fortunately they went in okay. The tooltip on the bridge shows that it's an elevation of 9 meters. It's actually 9 meters above that hill on the other side. It remembers the slope of the previous piece of bridge. So I drop it down 3 times, Q, 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 and it then drops to a current height of 0 meters. In other words, it should be touching the ground on that side of the road if we have the elevations correct. I'm just visually checking that it's definitely on the ground. It looks really ugly if it's slightly raised. I've deleted the mud road and I'm putting in a slip road that comes under the bridge. I'm struggling here, and the reason is I didn't extend the temporary road far enough, so the terraforming is right up to the edge of the carriageway here, causing a steep slope. So I'm going to drop the terrain just here back down to be level with the carriageway, and that will allow me to extend the slip road. When I put in the slip roads on the bridge, I'm using the left mouse button to terraform that hill, to smooth out the slope. You can make a much smaller curve on these slip roads, but it can look pretty odd because it can be really steep in places. So I've done a fairly wide turn, and I've used the left mouse button to make a smooth drop in elevation. When it goes amber, it allows me to smooth the levels out, so I'm going to end up with quite a nice drop down to the level of the carriageway. And then I can hook both of these into that new piece of slip road running alongside the carriageway. I've let that build now, and you see there we have a perfect bridge across onto the raised ground, and then the slip roads look pretty good. Except I realised that one is in the wrong direction and I use the arrow tool to change the direction, and then I confirm in my own mind that the arrows on all the slip roads make sense now and they're going in the right directions. The traffic AI is worked out for that small covered hull, It's got the ability to use these slip roads and the new bridge to get in the direction of the customs. To note here that the bridge itself is two-way, and there's no clear visual indication of that. You've got traffic from two directions can come across the bridge depending on which ramp they go. That's maybe a bit unusual in a highway situation in real life. What you might find in most countries is that there would be two bridges across side by side, or the bridge would be wide enough that it would have two separated carriageways. But we don't have that feature for a wide bridge in the game, nor incidentally do we have a tool to make a narrow single lane bridge, so there's no elevated slip roads. Though you could definitely build two road bridges next to each other if you wanted. I just go back into terraforming now and use the smooth tool to finish off where the slip road smoothing approach hasn't already done that. The smoothing tool won't touch the carriageway itself or the slip roads once they're laid down. It's just alter the ground around them. And I put some trees and bushes down. It's quite ugly with all of that brown mud effect on the ground, which will stay there for a while, so I'm just trying to cover that up with some vegetation. When I have all the slip roads of both intersections and the three roundabouts at each end all done to my liking, I'm now forcing the two carriageways to be one direction only. I don't massively care for the fact that you have arrows the whole way along painted on the road surface. That's not normal on most one-way roads. The arrows are usually only at the junctions where you join to show you which way to go. Now in the game, you don't actually need to. You could just put the arrows on the ground at the roundabouts. In fact, where the only connection is by a slip road, that already shows the AI where the traffic is allowed to go. So there's an argument that you wouldn't even need to force the two carriageways to be one direction. The traffic AI will work out that is what is going to happen anyway. But on the other hand, I prefer those carriageways to have the lane markings up the centre. And when they are two-way roads, there is no lane marking painted on the surface of the roads. There was another situation where I had a light poking through the new bridge, and I've got the slip road right up against the carriageway under the bridge, so I couldn't use the trick I normally do where I used a mud footpath to put a node in. So I've used a waypoint. It's going to leave a couple of signs there, but it's fine under the bridge out of the way. You can hardly see them anyway. But we can just pretend they are some sort of road signs telling traffic where to go. That's far better than having a light clearly poking through the surface of the bridge, especially at night when it's lit up and it's really obvious that it's there. I've disconnected that piece of road near the clothes factory finally. It's fundamental to the design that the only connections to the highway are through the intersections that we've developed. So that piece of gravel road shouldn't be connected directly into the highway that way. I've taken it out rather than develop a full-scale intersection there. You might feel this could be a mistake, because it is a shorter distance to get to the bus stop coming from the customs house, for example. But they have to navigate around a 90-degree corner, and on a gravel road the speed drops to 25 kilometers an hour when you're cornering. And we will have problems with priorities at this junction if traffic is higher. Anyway, it is definitely quicker to get from the customs to the bus stop and warehouses following the slightly longer route of the highway than going up this gravel road. I tested it, so I know for sure that that is the case. I've realised that I've got no power for the gas station at the customs. I'm just doing a little bit more work to finish off in that area. The gas station is now working and it's auto-purchasing fuel. They all are, by the way, and I want to build a small distribution office in this area. I use one of these modded ones with 8 slots. I'm sure I've got enough room to fit this here, but it's a bit of a tight squeeze at this size. A 4-slot one would fit, and I only need 3 or 4 vehicles for now, but I probably want to expand later. I want the distribution office to pick up fuel at the customs office and deliver it to the gas stations, rather than have the gas stations auto-purchasing. I've got unlimited money and haven't enabled realistic mode, but I will try to play realistically as much as possible. I buy some fuel tankers to operate out of the distribution office. One strange thing in the game is you cannot instruct a distribution office to deliver fuel to itself. I can send the fuel tankers to go to other distribution offices and fire stations or hospitals or anything like that, as well as gas stations. So it's also important that we built the gas station here, especially to supply the tankers in this distribution office. Now that the bushes and trees have started to grow, I'm just tidying that up where they are growing over the roads. The vehicles are not affected by that, even if you have a tree growing right in the middle of a road, but it looks weird, especially in the first-person camera mode. Now we've got a queue at the customs house for the first time, because we've got those tankers collecting fuel. The queue now can go all the way back onto the roundabout and further back up the highway without affecting the slip road to get to the gas station. That bus has actually been for gas and it's now coming back onto the roundabout to join the queue to get into the customs house. By the way, I got a nice little mod which has skins for the customs house and the depots and some of the other vanilla assets in the game, so you can change the colours on the customs house. I've changed it to a nice red as we are on the Soviet border. I'm just positioning the camera for the sort of flyover we did over real-life Kocise. We went up a wide road to a junction, then we came up here and we looked at the two gas stations and the construction office. So I think you can see we've been very successful in setting up something that looks like real life. To be clear, it's not my intention to create a republic that's identical to Kocise. I'm not going to do that. But where it's appropriate, I will take inspiration from features in Kocise or in other parts of Slovakia or Eastern European cities, and to show what the game can and can't do and to illustrate the historical background and show the urban planning issues. So let's conclude. We mainly looked at highways in this episode and built a highway early in our republic as if the Germans had built it before the war, or the post-war government had completed the work they planned, or somehow the Communist Party found the money to complete the work in the 1950s. And the role play is that it's already built before 1960. So that's another reason why I feel comfortable with having unlimited money to pay for this. We will cover streets and the distributor roads that connect to the highway, but they are topics for other videos to come. I will also come back to the issue about personal cars, car dealers, parking and things like that within the context of streets. Of course, I'm going to look at developing housing in the Soviet era and establishing industry to follow the central planning models. These are all topics that I have in mind, but if there's anything else you think I should cover, or there's anything in this video that you think is wrong or you haven't fully explained, put it in the comments. I'm happy to answer them, and to listen to suggestions or ideas you've got and maybe make them into a future video. Anyway, my name is Mark and I'm from Canny Gaming, and I'm out of here.